I want to start with a disclaimer. This video will contain spoilers for the Vintage Story's unique locations and perhaps the story itself, but the story is not the main focus of this video. This video will mostly talk about the mechanics behind these locations, and the story spoilers are pretty minor in that sense. Regardless, if you have not played through the story and do not want these story locations spoiled, turn away now. Vintage Story presents a player with opportunities to visit story locations in a procedurally generated world. These locations contain unique events that let the players experience new mechanics and fight bosses, all while driving the plot forward. After experiencing the 5 story locations implemented in the game so far, I can't help but feel that these story locations are a poor fit for a survival sandbox game in the current implementation. I just can't shake the feeling that they feel out of place in this voxel-based sandbox world. In this video essay, I will discuss what makes them a bad fit for the game and what can be done to improve the experience. Everything is timestamped, so if you want to hear me rant about the Devastation or listen to my proposed solutions, feel free to skip around. But first, I feel it is important to state that everything in this video is my own personal opinion on the matter. Furthermore, I do not mean to disparage the game. I love Vintage Story and everything it has to offer, but this does not mean it gets excluded from a healthy dose of criticism. I invite an open discussion in the comments, but let's try to maintain a certain level of civility. I personally enjoy hearing from all points of view, and I'm sure there'll be many counter opinions to me. And on this note, without further ado, let's get into it. I will naturally start with the first story location presented to the player, the Resonance Archives. This massive dungeon-like location was introduced in 1.18 update. Finding it involves trading a 10 bronze pickaxe per treasure map that marks a location on your personal minimap. The dungeon tends to spawn about 5,000 blocks away from the spawn on average, which is a decent distance, but still could be reasonably managed on foot. Nevertheless, the journey to and from these locations is part of the problem. More on that later though. When you arrive at the location, you might get immediately excited for all the awesome loot and decorative blocks you're about to get. You bust down the rusted doors to take as souvenirs, grab a few torch holders from the walls, and descend into the shaft. Immediately, the first problem with these story locations rears its ugly head. You soon realize that you can only interact with predetermined objects and only take predetermined paths. Everything in these story locations is claimed via the claim system, which means you can't break any blocks and you can't place any blocks. This immediately feels dissonant from the rest of the game. This entire time, the game has taught you that everything is breakable as long as you have the right tool for the job. This is the basic premise of the voxel-based survival game. The world is made out of blocks, and these blocks can be modified at will. Nothing up to this point in the game has taught you otherwise. Even ancient ruins can be picked to the bone, and most things can be recovered with a bit of glue. It feels odd then to be prevented from interacting with blocks, and has immediate gameplay ramifications that the game has not prepared you for up to this point. As an aside, the claim system does make a little more sense when the NPCs are involved though. More on that later though. The claim system creates some issues that start to break the game's own internal logic. For example, you can't place down a pot of food to refill your bowl. For someone who likes to carry around pots of grub and utilize only a single bowl, this was a rude awakening. My first time around in this dungeon involved constantly running back to the surface to refill my bowl, which felt a bit hacky at the time. I also accidentally doused my torch when going through the water section. Of course, I couldn't place down a torch to relight it, and didn't even bother going up to the surface to do it. I couldn't light up the library furnace as a result. I explored the library in the complete darkness instead. Compounding the issue, I was also doing it in the winter, which made dealing with relative cold pretty annoying, since you can't place down a campfire. The Resonance Archives does tend to be deep underground, and thus cold isn't as big of an issue unless of course you do it in extremely cold climate, which was my case. Plus, you can warm up by the furnace in the engineering as well. Regardless, these are minor gripes with how the Resonance Archives function. The bigger problem arises when you need to fight the bell in the bell workshop. Naturally, you want to equip a shield to fight this dangerous enemy. Of course, if you do that, you'll be plunged into the darkness due to not being able to use a lantern in the offhand. One solution is to throw torches on the ground to be able to see. Except, better not run over them when trying to dodge all the baddies, because you will automatically pick them back up. Well, you might think that the solution to this problem is to tweak the item pickup mode in the game settings to only pick up items when crouching. But oh wait, you need to crouch to block in this game for some reason. So sooner or later you will probably find yourself back in the darkness because you picked up the torches inadvertently while blocking. If only you could interact with the ground to place down a lantern, or slap some torches on the wall like you could everywhere else in the game up to this point. The final boss also suffers from the same problem, but it's still a little easier to throw a torch in the corner since the room isn't as confined as the Bell Workshop. Look, none of these issues are game-breaking, but the game feels counterintuitive in these story locations already. A bigger issue to me is that the dungeon is full of awesome decorative loot which is strictly inaccessible. I wish I could live out my steampunk fantasy by taking the Resonance Archives decorations for my own base. Now, I get why this has to be this way. The dungeon is designed to be progressed linearly. If you could take that block, place down this block, or break the wall over there, the entire linear approach suddenly falls apart. Furthermore, since only a single copy of this location spawns per world, it has to be functionally repeatable for multiple players. But can we all agree that it feels antithetical to the promises of a voxel-based world? If there is a slogan that would fit voxel-based survival sandbox, it would be "Everything is for the taking." My final gripe with Resonance Archives is the final boss. It's just not that interesting or entertaining. There doesn't seem to be a way to avoid his attacks with skill. Either you bring good enough equipment with tons of healing to down him, or you're not getting through. Once you complete the Resonance Archives, you can go back to the treasure hunter who sells you a mount and gives you a map to the second location, the Lazaret. This time around, the location tends to spawn between 10,000 to 15,000 blocks away from your spawn, potentially tripling the journey requirement. Now you have your trusty elk to take you there, which makes the journey a bit more tolerable. But here, a set of problems with the journey rears its ugly head. Let's start with the sheer amount of travel required to access these new locations. Now, I'm not saying that these distances are insurmountable with an elk. Instead, I will call them for what they are: unenjoyable. There isn't anything interesting to see during the journey. In the multiple hours of riding the elk to the various destinations, I have not seen a single point of interest. Occasionally, you will run into some ruins, but it's nothing you haven't seen thus far, and that's about it. There really isn't any interesting content to be seen during the journey, and you will quickly grow tired of the scenery during the ride. This problem is further exacerbated by an odd design choice. For some reason, these locations tend to spawn from east to west instead of north to south, which limits your biome exposure by a lot. You don't get to travel further south to see the hotter climates, or further north to experience the North Pole. And even if that was the case, the default pole to equator distance would still limit the biome variety by a lot. And yes, this setting is modifiable, but just like the lower location distance scaling, most people will play on the default settings then. And even if they do decide to change the settings, they might not be able to, since you can't change generation settings after you have already created the world. This is just the beginning though, let's talk about the elk. Despite having an elk, the current terrain generation is not super compatible with elk travel. The forests will often impede your progress since your vision will be blocked by the leaves. The leaves can also completely block your forward momentum as well, forcing you to look for small gaps to proceed forward. Furthermore, the elk is a super bad swimmer, and any amount of water will slow you down considerably. Why on earth can the elk not walk in 1 block deep water? Also, give me a break. Most large mammals can swim effectively. If that wasn't enough, you will inadvertently fall into caves, which will involve digging your mount out of the depth of hell. I mostly use the elk with the Plains and Valleys terrain mod, which makes the terrain generation considerably flatter, and riding the elk was still bad. I can't imagine using the elk with the default vintage story world gen. Without any doubt in my mind, in my future worlds, I will be reducing the distance between the story locations to an absolute minimum, as well as reducing the default pole-to-pole distance. There is another smaller issue I have with these story locations. They are always forced to spawn a certain distance from the world's origin, which makes every seed similar to each other. You will never find a seed where you can accidentally stumble upon any of these locations spontaneously, especially early in the game. Perhaps you have a small chance to stumble into the Resonance Archives, but the rest, forget it. Part of the appeal of the procedurally generated games is that each world is a mystery. Will you spawn on a big deposit of copper? Is there a massive limestone shelf nearby? Did you find bauxite just around the corner? How cool would it be to stumble upon Nadiya's village organically, for example? Maybe you can even choose to settle there, and the villagers can provide you with a land claim free plot so you can be part of the village. More on the village later though. Regardless, you have heard enough complaining about the travel. Let's talk about the second story location. You have arrived at the Lazaret. This location is inoffensive and forgettable, to be honest. You can find some grates that mark the location, but of course you can't break them to enter due to the claim by higher power shenanigans. Instead, you have to seek out the cave entrance. The issue with this location are mostly minor. One of them is the hyper-spawning mechanic, which means the enemies here are constantly respawning, which makes the exploration a little frantic and less enjoyable as a result. There is of course the same issue plaguing all other story locations with unmodifiable blocks. Another small nitpick is that the exploration feels inconsistent. There is a secret room you can find if you jump into one of the wells in one of the 3 rooms at the bottom floor. There were 3 identical shafts, one in each room, but only one was accessible to jump into. It made little sense that I couldn't jump down any of the others. I know, the real answer lies in the fact that they didn't lead to a predetermined escape route. Since nothing is modifiable, you would simply get stuck in a shaft with no way out, which once again feels restrictive and on the rails for a voxel-based sandbox game. It's like the game is afraid to give you power to make your own decisions and to break things. God forbid you bypass any of the Nego Studios' mandated and linear fun. Another minor gripe, you can pick up a bunch of decorative objects with an empty hand. The Resonance Archives teaches you that these objects are an important piece of the story's puzzle, so you might feel anxiety about keeping them, but they are just trophies in this case. And then, why can you pick these up, but not any of the other cool statue-like objects that could easily make for cool decor? This once again screams against all of the sensibilities that this voxel-based survival game has taught you up to this point. Regardless, once you acquire further travel instructions from the corpse on the ground, you get a marker for the village, which is by far the coolest location. It's fun to see Vintage Story's aesthetic approach to the settlement. It also makes a lot more sense than the Minecraft village. It is properly fortified with a big wall, which is probably a smart move when the world is full of horrid monsters. There are massive fields of crops growing on the outside, which feels enough to sustain a whole village. The structure and the flow make it feel like a real place in that sense. After suffering mostly alone in Vintage Story universe, it is nice to know that someone is out there. Here, the claim system makes a lot more sense. The villagers wouldn't necessarily like it if you start taking and breaking things in their homestead. Although, in a true open world fashion, I would prefer if you could take their stuff, but then face the consequences of all the villagers being pissed off at you, perhaps even turning hostile. The world would be a bit more immersive with freedom of choice, but it's just wishful thinking on my part, and I don't expect the developers to cater to my lack of humanity. Overall, I'm fine with things being unmodifiable here. One thing that bothers me though is that it feels out of place in this world. Be warned though, I'm really stretching my criticism here. So far, the world has done a poor job convincing me that there are survivors out there. But what about merchants, I hear you say? The merchants in the game make little sense in the way they're presented, and almost feel fake. They appear in completely random places, even in the extreme environments. They always stay put and never move, making it a question on how they restock their goodies. They never sleep, eat, or give me any indication that they are alive. They seem almost magical and disconnected from the physical reality. Besides merchants, we also see ancient ruins scattered around the world. However, at no point do we encounter a set of ruins that could have looked like any of these villages. With little evidence to suggest living outposts of this size and lonesome desolation of the survival experience, I couldn't shake the feeling that it simply didn't belong in this world. Nadiya's village felt ethereal and whimsical. Of course, the villagers point you to Devastation, which is the 4th location. And boy, do I have a lot to say about this one. First, visually the location is very cool. From the massive dark sphere surrounding the territory, to weird floating structures that look temporarily stuck together, and there's of course a giant mechanical bird pacing the territory. This bird really reminds me of something, but I can't really put my finger on it. However, it doesn't take long for the problems to start seeping through the cracks. First, exploring the Devastation is an exercise in futility. Even during the day, the area is designed to hyperspawn enemies that swarm you relentlessly. This makes exploration almost impossible. I would love to discover some awesome structures, look for secret chests sprinkled around the area, or just admire the art of the Devastation. Instead, you feel forced to rush to the central area of the Devastation to the dreaded parkour tower. Upon arrival, you get a new power that allows you to jump between the past, where everything is sparkly and new, and the present, where the decay is settled in. This is a very interesting development. This new mechanic is intended to help you to navigate to the top of the tower to face the tower's boss. The game has suddenly transformed from a sandbox survival game to a parkour game. While I'm not against the idea in principle, the execution leaves a lot to be desired. The game has not emphasized precise jumping skills anywhere else up to this point. Most challenges can be solved with blocks, whether it's traversing a gap or climbing a tall structure. The game also gives you no chance to establish any muscle memory in using this new time-shifting ability. Suddenly, you are expected to have a mastery of not only your jumping ability, but being able to swap timelines while doing so. The punishment for failure in most cases is a full restart from the bottom. Death is also a common side effect, which not only forces you to start over, but sometimes makes recovering your items impossible. This tends to happen more frequently when fighting the boss, but it can still happen during the climb nonetheless. Besides the precise jumping and time switching mastery, you need to have a good memory of the layout. When switching into the past, you can find the ledge you were standing on, well, it's no longer there. To add insult to an injury, the climbing solutions are not always obvious. There are some really questionable solutions that involve time switching. And honestly, I almost immediately gave up and started looking for solutions on YouTube. I was never a fan of these types of games and had little interest in mastering the puzzle aspect of the ascent. Perhaps I could find it more enjoyable if the stakes for failure were not so high. Right now, the entire section feels like it's for the masochists. Truth be told, once I looked up the solutions to the jumping puzzles and practiced the jumps for about an hour, my actual game attempt went reasonably well. I still had a couple of frustrating misses though, and it's not like it felt rewarding or enjoyable in the end. It also doesn't help that you still need to fulfill your basic survival needs. You have to continue to eat and also deal with the cold if you choose to visit the Devastation during the winter like I did. All of this while still having to obey the land claim limitations of this location. That means you can't put anything down, including campfire. Apparently, there's a campfire at the base of the tower you can use, but I did not realize this in time, nor is it hugely helpful when you're freezing your gonads during the climb. Now, for the boss at the top of the tower. It doesn't get any better here either. Once you figure out that all of the boss's attacks can be dodged via the time jump, it is relatively easy, but the punishment for error can still be starting over from scratch at the bottom of the tower. Thank God the bird doesn't regenerate its health at all. Apparently, you can also use an elevator to get back to the top of the tower once you make the initial ascent, but the use of the elevator is not obvious at all. Nothing up to this point suggests that any of the gadgets or levers are usable in the past world. I did not figure out the elevator in my initial run until I saw a post on Reddit. There are several more issues with the boss. You are practically forced into a ranged playstyle here. Maybe you are playing a blackguard like me? Well, too bad. You should have brought a bow with a ton of steel arrows and probably rolled a hunter. This might have not been a big deal if you could run home to get a bow, but oh wait. That's a 30,000 block ride home and another 30,000 block ride back. Now the boss does land occasionally, but for such an extremely short time and has such a weird hitbox that hitting him with a melee attack is almost impossible. If you didn't bring a bow or ran out of arrows, the boss does provide you with a workaround. Occasionally he will rain down his feathers, which can be used for arrows, and rarely picked up in the form of a spear, which is exactly what I had to do because I didn't think of bringing a bow. The problem with this approach is the stupid amount of health the boss has and the relatively low damage of his feathers. It took me 4 in-game days to down him using this method. Sure, you only need to take him to half health and it's a lot faster with a bow, but the balance feels off. One of the reasons it took me this long is because you can't find him at night. The darkness makes it almost impossible to track him in the sky, so you are forced to sit idly in the past until the morning comes. Where are the goddamn exploding beds when you really need them? To reiterate, thank God he doesn't regenerate his health. Once you down the boss, you can pick up the MacGuffin in the middle of the tower and move to the final 1.20 story location, the Tobias Cave. If you haven't enjoyed the travel so far, well, there's still more of it. The final location is pretty good. The interior design of the cave dwelling is something to behold. I'm sure many people will come out of this with cool ideas for their own interiors from the visit. You also get a lot of story exposition at this location from the Tobias himself. I can't complain too much about this location. Or can I? For one, you are still limited from interacting with the objects in the cave due to the claim system. When I entered this location for the first time, I could not find the entrance initially. I tried digging down from the top of the hill, only to encounter the impenetrable boundary of the structure. But I talked about this problem already ad nauseam. The other issue, you are now forced to do the journey back to your spawn. A full-blown journey without the stop gaps of other locations. For me, it was over 30,000 blocks and took over an hour. All of this while still not seeing anything interesting on the journey back. Sure, Tobias gives you some Jonas parts and tells you how to construct a translocator that would take you back to his cave. Too bad, you still have to make it back first, gather required resources, and only then will you have a shortcut. Jump on your trusty elk and get going. Stay away from the pesky caves though. Look, I like these special locations and I want them to be great. So let's talk about my vision on how this entire experience can be taken up a notch. First, let's talk about the claim system. There probably isn't a way to remove the claim system effectively from these locations without compromising the experience, especially because these locations are meant to be replayable for multiplayer servers, since only a single location generates per server. Nevertheless, I would absolutely love to get my hands on some of these decorative pieces. Perhaps some of the more prominent single-block objects can be scattered around these locations to take home. Imagine rustling through an old chest in the Resonance archives and suddenly stumbling on a bunch of spare maintenance parts that the inhabitants left over. Lamps, pipes, devices. Now, I understand why some of the larger props can be easily transported, but the thematic, decorative clutter could be awesome to play with. Another minor fix that would be awesome is the ability to use certain high-value objects in these dungeons. I simply ask for an ability to place down lanterns, torches, campfires, and cooking pots. This would solve the issue of satiety, warmth, and light that plagues these locations. Perhaps it might break the linearity of some puzzles, but if somebody can figure out how to beat the dungeon using the lantern as a jumping prop, more power to them. The developers don't need to micromanage their experience so tightly. Now, let's talk about my suggestions to improve the boring travel to these locations. The elk mount can stand some improvements and would go a long way to make the journey more tolerable. I know that Vintage Story is trying to be rooted in realism, but I would love the ability to summon and unsummon your mount, similar to how it works in V-Rising or most MMOs. Have you fallen into a cave? No problem, unsummon your mount, climb out of the cave and resummon it. Encountered a massive ocean or lake? No problem, unsummon your mount, hop on a raft, traverse the body of water, and resummon your mount on the other side. The elk should also be a much more prolific swimmer regardless. Two more issues to solve would be slope climbing and forest visibility. The elk should climb one-block slopes a little faster and smoother. Currently, the stutter stepping that it does really kills your forward momentum and it makes it feel a lot less enjoyable. I would love it if the elk had a smoother climbing motion. The forest visibility would probably be a lot harder to solve. Perhaps it could be achieved by reducing the leaf opacity while mounted and in proximity of trees. Maybe the leaf collision can also be reduced while mounted, so going through the forest is a little less daunting. These are just some of the ideas. It is up to the developer to find the solutions, but I do think these pain points are real. While the mount improvements are a must, another pain point of the travel is that there are not many things to see out there in the world. Vintage Story desperately needs random encounters in the world with long-distance travel and exploration, something outside of the story locations. The team needs to look no further than Better Ruins mod for inspiration, as that would be a significant improvement already. Imagine having a variety of cool places to find in the world. Ruined outposts, derelict castles, abandoned mines, or people simply living their lives. This would also solve a parallel problem of plausibility when it comes to the story locations. Nadiya's village would feel a lot more plausible if you were built up to finding it. First, you find a few basic ruins like we have right now. Second, you find the merchant's dwelling. Wait, so these guys actually have a permanent home? They don't just reside in the wilderness 364 days a year? And he or she has a spouse? Wait, there are a couple of kids running around? Next, you stumble upon a small functioning outpost that contains a couple of houses and a simple windmill. You encounter the 3 to 4 people living there and say hi. But that's not it. You find a large-scale abandoned village and rummage through the remains. Suddenly, Nadiya's village does not feel so out of place in this world. On top of these unique locations, it would be nice to see a bit more biome variety on your journey. And this one is a head-scratcher for me, as this is very achievable with a few minor tweaks to the settings. The simplest short-term solution is to reduce a couple of default settings, as well as spawning preferences to the story locations. At bare minimum, I would prefer for these locations to start spawning north to south. The biome variance in Vintage Story is intimately tied to the temperature of the region, which is intimately tied to its latitude. This simple spawning change would lead to more vertical map traversal, which would impart the highest temperature fluctuations in the surrounding areas as you travel, and thus lead to a much higher biome variance that you observe. Regardless, how cool would it be to be forced to visit the tropics or the North Pole to access some of these locations? Of course, even when traveling over 40,000 blocks, the default pole to equator distance of 1,000 blocks still makes this latitude change pretty minor even over that distance. I would prefer to have the distance to 50,000 as a default setting. 100,000 block distance is absolutely massive, and even reducing it by a half would still entail a large journey to the poles. Now that we changed the spawning orientation and changed pole to equator scaling, we can also probably scale the story location's distance to half of the default setting while we're at it. I'm just not a big fan of spending countless hours on travel. So in general, change the spawning orientation, compress the travel distance, and introduce some cool points of interest. The ball is in your court and Nego Studios. As far as for the Devastation, this location needs a lot more cooking, and the devs know it, since it's something they have slated for improvement in the next update. But let's go through my ideas for improvements anyway. First, I would either completely disable the enemies, or make them fully neutral to the player, or maybe reduce the hyper-spawning to something more reasonable. Currently, the game incentivizes you to rush into the central tower. Let us freely explore the zone and enjoy the art of this place. Onto the dreaded tower. The jumping sections need a lot of work, and with less punishing consequences. For starters, the solutions to some of these jumps are not obvious at all, and I would have never figured them out on my own. A bit more guidance would be welcomed. The time switching requires pretty good hand dexterity and coordination, and the cooldown on the ability is unnecessary. The cooldown feels restrictive and prevents you from making rapid decisions while slowing down your ability to practice these jumps in the first place. And why on earth is a default keybind for this ability so bad? It is a pretty far stretch when you are expected to make extremely precise time switches in the mid-jump. I almost immediately had to rebind it to something closer to my index finger. I don't think the game should punish you so severely for failure in these parkour elements. I would appreciate more save zones or checkpoints if you will. Once you progress past a certain point, the game should reward you with incremental safety. Once you reach the top floor, the game should make absolutely sure you understand that the elevator is now an option to bypass the jumping section. Also, with how easy it is to die on a weird ledge, making your gear virtually unrecoverable, perhaps there should be no fall damage here at all. Fall damage and other survival aspects still being enabled here feels out of place. I don't want to be forced to interact with hunger and cold or sent back to the Stone Age when I'm doing the tower. After all, it's already understood that this location is in a weird time flux. So why not make it special and just straight up disable Satiety Drain while preventing the player from getting cold? And fuck it, disable the fall damage too. We are already breaking a bunch of cardinal rules of a survival sandbox, so why not go all the way? Of course, my earliest suggestion of letting players use high-valued objects such as torches, campfires, and lanterns could go a long way to making hunger and cold a non-issue anyway. The boss being unapproachable at night is also a problem, so the devs should make sure that there is enough ambient light to be able to face the boss any time of the day. Make it harder, but not impossible to fight him at night. Speaking of the boss could stand to have less HP, and you should be rewarded for using the arrows and spears he provides with a big damage boost. There could be melee phases as well, so players don't regret playing something like a Blackguard. Currently, a hunter with a recurve plus steel arrows is clearly by far the most superior way of handling the boss. In return, the boss can do a lot more damage with his attacks. Since fall damage is disabled and death by a fall is not a threat, his attacks could be more about dealing direct damage, while falling down could be just an annoyance, forcing you to make a return via the elevator. This would still highly encourage you to master the time dodging ability to dodge his attacks, and make armor more relevant to boot. The Resonance Archives boss could stand some adjustments too. A more interesting and memorable attack pattern could be an interesting skill check in this fight. Right now, all it is a tank and spank encounter. Lastly, a short aside for the Tobias Cave. I would love it if he gave you an option to teleport you back to the spawn of your world the first time you bring him the lens, saving you all of the excess travel back. You have done enough travel up to this point to justify a little reprieve. This concludes my rant about Vintage Stories story locations. If you're still here, I love you. Look, I think the story locations are cool, and the story itself is captivating enough that even I, who normally doesn't care much for the story in my survival games, is excited to see where it goes. It is a very interesting mix of steampunk, horror, and sci-fi. The artistic design of these locations is top-notch too. Well, maybe outside of the Lazaret. I just wish that the story experience would be more approachable and less frustrating. At its core, Vintage Story is a survival sandbox game, and the story takes a sharp departure from the sensibilities of the genre. I know that Anego Studios was unhappy with some of the story's jank, so I hope some of the pain points I brought up are on their radar. And if they are not, I have an interview scheduled with Elvis, the guy behind the story structures. I will certainly suggest some of these improvements and pick his brain on these locations as they currently are. So be on the lookout for the interview. Meanwhile, I released an interview with QP Tech, the modder behind Chisel Tools. It is an interesting conversation, and if you're curious to hear his opinions on the game and the modding scene, it's on my channel. Meanwhile, I'm working on and will be releasing the 300 Days Plains and Valleys episodes soonish. Following, I have a really cool concept for a much more cinematic and cozy playthrough of Vintage Story in the 100 Days style video. This time around, I want to use a secondary camera account to run on a server so it can capture awesome footage. If I can't have a replay mod, I guess I will have to start doing things this way. So strap in, a lot more content is coming your way this year, and on this note, Oscilloscape is beaming out.